I'm Susie Russell, Network Coordinator for the Community Supported Agriculture Network UK, one of over 30 national CSA networks across all continents, representing millions of CSA members, and a proud member of Urgenci, the global CSA network. It's a huge pleasure to be here at this amazing, inspirational global conference, and especially in the midst of the struggles of the global pandemic, which is the topic for this session. I'm delighted to bring together two CSA farmers, Tom and Florent from the UK and France, respectively, and Judith Hitchman, President of Urgenci, to discuss CSA's response to COVID-19 and what we can learn from it. So I'm going to start by asking Tom from Kaitan CSA in Wales, UK, to introduce himself and his CSA.
Thanks a lot, Susie. Yeah, it's great to be here. So I can tell you a little bit about our CSA. Kaitan is based on the Gower Peninsula in South Wales. We operate on 8 acres, of which about 6 acres is in regular production, and then we've got a couple of acres of fruit and ponds and wild areas. We supply 127 households on a weekly basis all year round, and we have about 80 on a waiting list. So it's all vegetables. There's a very little bit of soft fruit, but the majority of it is vegetables. We're a company limited by guarantee with 7 directors, 3 of whom are growers. So I'd say we're a grower-led CSA, in effect. The growers make decisions from day to day. 2 of those growers are running the CSA, and 1 of those growers is running an enterprise within the CSA, which is growing salads and greens for local businesses. A key element of our work is working with volunteers. So I'd say, we've had volunteers right since the beginning, some volunteers who've been with us the whole 7 years we've been going on a weekly basis, and they're really a key element of our work, very important part of how we operate. And we also have trainees each year. We have 2 trainees each year between, or 1 trainee and a couple of European volunteers, I should say, between March and October each year. And we've been really fortunate that 3 of our trainees have stayed on. Out of the 5 that we've had, we've managed to keep 3. So Lizzie is working with me all the time. Francesca has set up her own enterprise within Kaitan, and Abby we've supported over the last year or so to set up her own CSA just locally, which is now supplying another 65 households just within 10 minutes of where we live. We're also running school projects. So the school element is an important part of what we do. We're working particularly with children from Swansea East, which is the poorer area of Swansea. We've been working for a number of years with 5 schools in that area, just introducing the children to sustainable farming and the possibility that, for them, they could in the future potentially be farmers themselves, or at least grow their own food. And then I'd say lastly, an element which we're sort of involved in more and more is outreach and support work. So we're supporting other CSAs to set up within Wales. We're doing a little bit of work with 1 or 2 in England and 1 in Southern Ireland at the moment as well. So yes, that's us. Thank you, Susie. Cheers.
Thanks, Tom. That was great. What a beautiful farm. And now Florent from La Ferme Sapousse in France. It'd be lovely to hear a bit about you and your CSA.
Yeah. So I'm Florent. We're at La Ferme Sapousse. We're about 80 kilometers from Paris, and we've been set up about 10 years ago. We've got 4 hectares of land, which I think I tried to make the conversion into acres, and I think it's around 9 acres. We've been set up responding to an announcement from the city council willing to develop organic farming on the town. We're doing vegetables, as you can see here, fruits, aromatic plants, and honey. We're in partnership with around 150 families. And what is important for us is beyond all the food we're producing is to have a farm which leaves space for doing activities with the children from the schools in the neighborhoods, like what Tom was describing a bit. And this is interesting to see that in France and in the UK we're doing the same things. We're also giving space to local artists, because for us having a farm that is beautiful is very important. And so some are doing shows, some are doing sculptures that are within the farm. And we're also having every week a group of disabled people that come and have activities on the farm, so that the farm brings something to them as well. And we're also getting lots of things from them. So that's what we're doing.
Thanks, Florent. Again, just amazing how CSA brings in so many different elements: schools, artists, and of course food. So now I'm going to ask Judith, President of Urgenci, to give us a bit of background of Urgenci and exactly what they do. Thanks, Judith.
Thank you, Susie. Well, Urgenci is the network of national and regional CSA networks around the world. I would say that we have three key objectives in Urgenci. The first is for people to exchange and share their practice from around the world and to build a movement, so movement building. The second is to develop projects and especially learning tools that we can share around the world and support each other and learn from one another through actual tools that we have on our knowledge hub, which is developing very fast at the moment. And the third, which is what I've been doing really for the last 15 years, is to work collectively on policy. Policy through the civil society mechanism of the Committee on World Food Security and the FAO and United Nations more generally, but also at European level, particularly right now on the farm to fork and looking forward towards the Green New Deal. So our role is really everything that is fed into Urgenci from the national networks, from the bottom up, to take this forward collectively to try and ensure that we are playing our role within the global food sovereignty and solidarity economy movement.
Thanks, Judith. So, moving on to the kind of theme of this session, we know that in many countries, COVID-19 has provoked a huge increase in demand for short supply chain produce. Florent, what's been your experience of the impact of COVID-19, both from the personal local point of view of La Ferme Sa Pousse, and also if you could give us an overview of CSA in France and how that's been affected, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah. What we've seen, and especially during the first lockdown, but it still is the case now, is that people were afraid of going to supermarkets for health reason, and small markets were closed, especially during the first lockdown. And the consequence of that is that people willing to have fresh food went to CSA. So there was a huge demand. We had at the beginning of the crisis, we had around 4 to 5 people coming to the farm every day, asking if they could buy something, insisting on us to sell them a salad or something. So we had a huge demand, and what we analyzed is that basically people were seeking food safety, real safety, because they were afraid, and they were really looking for social link because everything was closed, and CSAs really represented the response to these two needs. So huge demand. We personally, as a farm that is engaged in a CSA partnership, we had no problem to sell, obviously, but we did not produce more to respond to that new demand. We had other colleagues, farmers that were not yet selling in CSA systems, but were selling in small markets, who had real problems because they had vegetables, fruits, meats that they could not sell anymore because the markets were closed. And we saw CSAs opening their doors to some of these farmers. And we saw citizens creating new CSAs, especially to help these farmers. So what is interesting is that still now some of these farmers stayed in the CSA system, and what we basically learned from that is that there is a huge demand, and the demand is still higher than before the crisis. So as network of CSAs in France and in the different region, what we're doing is to try and help preparing farmers that are not yet in the CSA system in converting themselves into a farm that is open, a bit more open to citizens. So for us, having a real work on trying to prepare these farms to converting into CSA is really vital. And the second thing we learned is that we needed to create more farms, because what we want is not huge CSAs, we want many CSAs, and for that we want many farmers. So we're doing a whole work trying to go into schools, as Tom was saying, in order to talk about our work, our job, to get young people to be willing to do this job. And we have lots of different trainings to prepare these people becoming farmers. The training is one thing, and access to land is another. So we're doing also work with different associations in order to get land. I don't know how to say that, but to make sure that these people can get access to land, because access to land, and I'm sure in the UK is the same, is really complicated, especially when like us, you're not sons or daughters of a farmer. And for us to be able to do this work, to prepare farmers becoming entering the CSA system, and to basically create new farms, you need public money, because you need to finance the networks that are really accompanying these new farms. And we'll probably be talking about that later, but for us, that's what the Common Agricultural Policy, and it'll be different in the UK, but that's what public money should be used for, rather than investing in a huge tractor in one farm. If you invest money in salaries of a network that is preparing new farmers, I think you use the money much better.
Thanks, Florent. Really interesting. And I love that you highlighted the kind of real solid base of CSA, food safety and social links, and how suddenly people really realized that was what they needed in the face of COVID. And it's been there all the time in CSA. So yeah, really being recognized. Tom, be great to hear a bit about how you're experiencing COVID-19 at Kaitan, and yeah, a sort of overview of how it's affecting CSA in the UK, and how CSAs in the UK have responded.
Sure, yeah. So yeah, I'll start off with just how it affected us, and then I'll say a little bit about how, in my view, it's kind of affected the wider UK. So for us, I'd say the main thing is that actually there's been very little effect. You know, we've remained very steady. We're supplying food on a weekly basis. You know, we had to make minor adjustments to sort of health and safety aspects of what we do, how people pick up their veg, how our volunteers operate at the field. But my overall feeling was that actually it was amazing how smoothly everything operated and how little we were disturbed, while everything around us seemed to be falling into chaos. So other than that, there was a really big increase in membership inquiries. We were on 120 just before COVID, and then we went up to 127 because we're pretty much at capacity already, but we decided we'd go up to 127. We had a waiting list of about 70 beforehand, and that went over 100 basically between March and June, I'd say. Our members were really appreciative. I think there was an initial kind of panic at first that, you know, where's our food going to come from? And there was a good sort of month or so of the first lockdown where the way our veg pickup works is that we're there on a Thursday to meet and greet people. But if you don't collect, you can come anytime over the next 3 days before any food that's left is donated to someone else. And that the first few weeks, people just showed up and took their veg as quickly as they possibly could, as if it was going to disappear if they didn't get it. So there was suddenly like this really strong feeling of a real need for food and local food. And actually people felt very happy about the fact that they had a weekly food supply. Another big thing for us that was really obvious was Abby, who we had supported as a trainee 2 or 3 years ago. She was launching her CSA this spring, summer. And we had this big waiting list of 70, and we thought, oh, well, you know, Abby could take 70 of those. But it very quickly became apparent with all of this activity going on in Panic, she quickly had over 60 members of her own CSA in a very rural community close to us without touching any of our waiting list. So the demand was just growing exponentially at first. I'd say other than that, on a local basis, there was just a general feeling of interest in what we were doing. I think a lot of organizations and groups who previously we'd been on the periphery and they'd sort of passed the field, or they knew we were there, they knew we were some people producing vegetables. Suddenly, actually, there was a real interest in what we were doing from farmers, local government, local newspaper, social housing projects, you know, all sorts of different elements. They started to sort of approach us and look at, you know, how they could support us or how they could get involved and how they could duplicate this kind of project. So that's on a local basis. And then, well, from chatting to Susie to get updated as well on what's going on in the wider UK, I'd say, again, the overall feeling across the UK was a kind of business as usual, that CSAs just carried on as usual. Through all this chaos, they were really a steady and reliable element of local food supply. I think there was the Food Foundation did some research in February to late March, and they found that CSA had not expanded in the same extent that box schemes had expanded. But we think this is basically down to the fact that CSAs would have already had all their crop plans done for the year and are not in a position to quickly take on lots of new members. But they had sort of dealt with that in different ways, that some CSAs were basically supporting other organic producers who had lost market. So say they had a local market gardener near them who had lost access to the market they were selling into. Some CSAs would buy from them to increase their shareholder number. And many CSAs in a similar position to us would put time into supporting other CSAs to set up. And then I'd say there was a couple of other bits of research. Well, oh, I should mention the UK CSA network also. That was really interesting that they went from having 81 members in March to around 130 members now. So their membership has increased drastically, and their press inquiries have doubled or more than doubled. And overall, there's just been a general increase in demand across the country for short supply chain produce. And this has sort of shone through in a couple of reports. So Food Farming and Countryside survey found that 42% of adults valued their food more since COVID, and 40% of adults are wanting to cook from scratch more or are cooking from scratch more. And then the Co-op food supermarket in the UK, they did a UK ethical consumer report, which found that consumers were wanting to buy local. That was up by 40%. And organic sales, basically between May 2019 and May 2020, had gone up by a fifth. And I'd say all of this sort of backed by this general food scare was backed by issues like the milk pour away. So in early April, which people probably heard about, in the UK, as supply chains broke down for businesses, there was over 10,000 gallons of milk just poured away from farms. And I think all this added up to basically people searching out small-scale local suppliers. And I think CSA has really stood out as steady, secure, and very much in demand. So that's me.
Thanks, Tom. And yeah, just some really great points. I think just wanted to underline, I think Florent and Tom both kind of referenced the kind of business as usual and the rapid organisation of the workforce around new regulations. We know we ran some webinars really early on, both to support our farms to work out how they could operate safely, especially the ones that had lots of volunteers coming in and wanting. I mean, most of our CSAs saw an increase in volunteer numbers, or certainly a lot of volunteers sort of wanting to come and help. I think, again, that connection with food and connection with land has felt so important through COVID. And also just something that, again, you both mentioned around the kind of model of mushrooming. So whereas there was a kind of increased size in some sectors, what CSA has done has seen an increase in farms. So really seen, which is, it seems like such a healthy way to propagate ourselves. Rather than getting bigger, we get more of us. So yeah, wanted to hand over to Judith and get her sort of view on how COVID's affected CSA globally. Thanks, Judith.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks a lot. I think that Tom and Florent have touched on many of the key elements that we saw around the world. Urgenci got funding to do a global survey on the impacts of COVID on short supply chains, local solidarity partnerships between producers and consumers, which translates obviously in most cases as CSA. And the first thing that really stood out is something that you both mentioned, which is the huge level of resilience, as well as the huge level of instant capacity to adapt, because the health and safety measures were easy to implement. Local authorities and national authorities around the world allowed CSA to continue working, because there are very, very few people touching the food from when it is harvested until it's actually in the consumer's hands and in their fridges. What did change in many countries, for example, in Spain, in the Basque Country, and in various other places, was the home delivery. Because with COVID, a lot of people have been, particularly the elderly or people with compromised health, have been sheltering at home in very strict kind of lockdown. And CSAs instantly, because they are communities, have been able to support people who are disabled and people who are sheltering at home through home deliveries. Now that had a bit of a downside, because, for example, in the Spanish Basque Country, where they switched to a home delivery system, it meant that the producers had less time for the production. The other thing is, I totally agree with what you both said, that CSAs obviously operate by planning the production around the number of subscribers to the CSA. So it's almost impossible to multiply the number of shares, but it is possible to support the creation of new CSAs, which both of you have mentioned. However, some CSAs, for example, in Belgium, some of the CSAs were operating partly as a CSA, partly supplying restaurants, partly supplying farmers markets. So they did have extra capacity, and they were able then to take on extra eaters into the CSA. Some countries had an absolutely huge initial increase in demand. For example, at the very beginning of the pandemic, the demand in China, where there are something like 1,500 CSAs, is absolutely huge. They had something like 300% increase in demand, which obviously, was really difficult to deal with, partly because the specificity of CSA in China is that it is all organic, using the participatory guarantee system rather than third-party certification. And all the other farmers were asking them to include their produce, and very few of these farmers could be integrated because they are not organic farmers. And the whole thing of CSA in China is that it's based on safe food, in other words, free of pesticides and other contaminants. So that was one aspect. In North America, in the United States, there were a lot of very interesting things happening as well, with CSA working with inner city people who didn't have access to fresh fruit, vegetables and fresh food altogether. And there was a big increase there, including some CSAs that had a little surplus, working with some of the food pantries or food banks, which really shifts the paradigm away from the charity aspect. In Brazil, the MPA, the Via Campesina movement of small-scale food producers, any surplus they had, they brought it into the favelas, because people really were losing their jobs. They didn't have access to any kind of food, let alone fresh food. And there were huge donations, there still are huge donations being made of surplus production beyond, over and above what could be done for the subscribers that's been going into the favelas. I think the solidarity systems that CSAs operate, which can be sliding scale payment or paying forward extra shares, has also been very helpful in countries where people have lost their jobs, because the number of food secure at global level has now doubled. So these are some of the aspects. Also, the food sovereignty movement as a whole has been pushing the United Nations and the Committee on World Food Security to be more reactive. We got COVID as a key element in the Committee on World Food Security session last October. We produced a collective report which speaks very strongly about the resilience of CSAs, which is very important. And Urgenci is about to publish a report on the survey we carried out in over 20 countries. It'll be hot off the press in a few days, so you can see a lot more there. Also, I'd like to say that there was something of a bump phenomenon. You talked about the mushrooming and the creation of new CSAs. We haven't been able to evaluate that yet. It's too soon. But there was this huge increase in demand in subscriptions, and that went on for a little while. And then there was an ease in the lockdown in most countries of the summer. So there was a bit of a fall off in some of the extra demand. That seems to be going up again. So there's a bit of a yo-yo phenomenon in terms of the demand, but I would say that the overall level of awareness of the need to build resilient, sustainable, healthy local food systems, there is a much, much higher level of awareness than we've ever had. And I think this is translating into a lot of different things, not just CSA, but also veggie boxes in supermarkets and things like that. But we're not in competition with that sort of thing. I think CSA is recognized for what it is, for supporting the community, for being solidarity based and based in a logic of access to land and local food production of a different kind, and food sovereignty in all its multifaceted elements. So I think we're really showing just how strong CSA is as a response at global level.
Thanks, Judith. Yep, absolutely agree. And I just wanted to pick up on solidarity, which you just mentioned. It's a core value in CSA, particularly solidarity with the local community. And I just wondered if, Tom, you could talk a bit about how solidarity, how it was lived on your CSA during COVID.
Yeah, I'm sure I touched on this a little earlier, but there was very much a feeling of like a shared mission between the growers, the volunteers, the members, but very much that core group of our trainees, our volunteers and our growers, that actually we just felt like, yeah, like there was all this chaos and so many people stopping work and being isolated at home. It was actually beautiful weather as well. And we were every day at the field, and we just felt like really lucky to be part of this system that worked so well and would allow us to come and work together in the field. And I think we had a slight drop off in some of our older members volunteering, and we didn't really know quite how to deal with the volunteering at first. But once we sort of ironed that out and we had safe ways in place of people coming to the field, which didn't take much time, then I think just for people's mental well-being and just to be part of that, I think it was just a great feeling between everyone. So I'd say that was the core and most obvious thing. Our members were really appreciative, and we had, lots of notes and emails from members just saying how happy they were to be part of it. And again, it kind of buoyed us up. It's always good as a grower to hear that your members are happy with what you're doing and just to have some feedback. So that sort of buoys us up as well. And then I think outside of that, there's then this sort of outer layer who I also touched on earlier of, groups who we're not necessarily in contact with that often, and they're sort of exterior to what we're doing, like the local government and local farmers and local colleges, university, but they all very much sort of gravitated towards us and asked us questions about what we were doing. And now we're sort of starting to run various projects with a lot of them. So that just, it makes you feel much more integrated in the wider community. I think as a CSA, you already feel very much attached to the other growers and to your immediate members, but we're still sort of a bit the oddballs in the local, the wider local community. But it suddenly felt like we were very much valued and accepted for what we did. So that's been great. And then I'd say also just briefly on a national basis, there was a real feeling of solidarity between like the CSA network, running discussion sessions with farmers and supporting market gardeners to convert to being CSAs. And we are regularly in contact with the Land Workers Alliance, the Organic Growers Alliance, Lantra, Social Farms and Gardens. Like all of those groups, they kind of checked up on us and they brought us together. And another thing, actually, my daughter pointed out earlier was how much more time I spend online. And actually, in a way, it's given like real solidarity with a much wider group of people that I wouldn't normally be in contact with, because I tend to not travel that much to these wider meetings. Like joining the board of the UK CSA network, actually the fact we can do things online has allowed us to be in contact with people on a much more easily on a wider scale. So yeah, I think it's been for CSA, it's really brought us together.
Thanks, Tom. Florent, how about in France and on your CSA? How's solidarity played out there for you?
We also have seen loads of solidarities within our CSA, and especially as Judith and Tom was saying, in order to bring food to those that elderly people or disabled were able to access it. but beyond that, what we realized also is that they were, during this crisis, we really saw the huge food inequalities, and especially for poor families that would not have access to food for the children, especially to food at school, because school were closed. We really saw huge inequalities there, and therefore many CSAs, some did already do some work on that, but many CSAs are now willing to work much more on access to food quality, to food of good quality, and so we have examples of some members of CSAs that are contributing to a fund within the CSA in order to pay part of the price of the box of some poor families, in order to integrate them within the partnership. And beyond that, some local authorities are contributing to these funds in order to get more people within these systems from different classes. And what we saw during at the end of the crisis is something really interesting, is the French Social Security, which contacted our national network of CSA in order to imagine how a national system could work, where the funds of the Social Security could be used to give access to good quality food to much more people. So this is something which we really had all in mind, but with this crisis, many more people are willing to work on giving more access to good quality food. And at national level, the CSAs are in a partnership with other networks, unions, environmental organization, a network in which we're thinking of what's the next step in terms of rights to food for all, and we're working on a concept of developing a food social security, which would, like the health social security system, could be the future in terms of ensuring for each individual. For instance, we're working with economists on different models, but we're working on a scheme where there would be 150 euros per month that each individual could spend with a local farm that is under a convention that is discussed at local level. So this is the future, but for us, we're really wanting to work on. We've developed within the CSA a real solidarity system, but let's try and bring these good spirits and good values within the wider society.
Thanks, Flora.
Could I jump in there, maybe?
Of course.
Just two things on things that Tom and Florent have said. First of all, Tom mentioned all the volunteers. One of the responses we got to our questionnaire from the Netherlands was people were on really, really strict lockdown there, but they were allowed out for essential work purposes. So a lot of people said that volunteering on a farm was an essential work purpose, and they ended up with farms that were more like campsites and really having to figure out how to deploy and how to use all this extra additional volunteer work where people really didn't have any experience of farming. So, I think there was a lot more volunteer work going on, and there still is. On what you just said, Florent, there's some really interesting initiatives going on, for example, in the States, where people who are on food stamps are able to exchange food stamps for CSA shares. There are also quite a number of town halls, local authorities in France that are supporting access for marginalized people to CSAs. And what you mentioned in terms of the future food social security, I think is so essential. And I'd like to see how we can push this maybe at United Nations level or at European level, because it's not something we've done more than mention. I think we need to develop a strategy, a clear strategy for pushing it at that level. Because I think that this aspect of food equity, food justice, although it's not the subject of what we're talking about here, but it is linked to health and the pandemic. If you like, people who are healthy are not suffering so much from severe COVID, and healthy food is a really important factor in contributing to fighting COVID.
Thanks, Judith. Yeah, and we know mental health as well as physical health is improved by interacting or being a member of your CSA. There was a lovely example of one of the UK CSAs who had some volunteers who had to shield and couldn't come out at all, and were really upset that they weren't going to have any contact with the soil. And so that CSA took them seed trays and compost and asked them to plant seeds for them, which just gave them that connection back. And then those were taken away and planted at the CSA. So they were still getting their hands in soil, which is just such a lovely thing, and happens because it's local level and everybody knows each other and is there supporting each other. So something really special about that. So I guess, yeah, we've seen all these examples of how CSA we knew CSA was resilient, but this pandemic has really showed how CSA has stayed solid and then been able to reach out further. In the UK, we've seen a real increase in inquiries from people wanting to set up CSAs in urban areas, which has been really interesting, and a lot and really making those links with food justice and how we can work to ensure that food justice happens. So I don't know if any of the three of you wanted to add anything on the kind of overall resilience of CSA, and then we'll take a few questions from people.
I could probably just add something. I think something important to understand about CSA is that basically we were built to be resilient. We were built to resist to crisis. Initially, we were built to make sure that we could resist to ecological crisis. Thanks to CSAs and thanks to CSAs, a farm like us can resist to a climate crisis, because the partnership we're having with members and eaters is actually providing a sufficient security to deal with a climate crisis, or deal with a storm, or deal with something like that, because we're getting money that are paying the food, whatever happens in terms of climate. In terms of economic crisis, these systems are actually creating, while we're living in economic crisis, these systems are creating jobs in the countrysides where it's almost where it's very difficult to create jobs. So the spirit that brought Japanese mothers decades ago to go to their farmers and invented the CSA system, it was to resist to crisis. So that is why we resisted that way, because a small scale system is actually the best system to be able to be resilient and to adapt.
I'd like to add to what you've just said there, maybe, Florent, by saying that CSAs in France and around the world are also part of the global social and solidarity economy movement, because the two aspects combined of food sovereignty and solidarity economy, which incidentally is one of the 10 elements of agroecology, is recognized by the FAO, are two of the key elements in system change. Because we're facing, as you said, a climate crisis, we're facing an economic crisis, we're facing a financial crisis, and we need system change. We need to move away from the neoliberal system that exploits our planet and people with an unjust system, and move towards an equitable system based on social and solidarity economy. And the question that was posed about housing cooperatives linked to CSAs, linked to cooperative energy that is managed at local level, linked to community finance, etc., is the way forward. And it is a very important part of what we are doing, because what we are doing is actually very revolutionary.
Tom, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that, yeah, I mean, probably just to recap on some of the things. I mean, for me, it just stands out that CSA has been incredibly resilient through this whole time. And I just feel very lucky to be part of it and part of that movement. And yeah, I think I was just checking my notes to see if there was anything else. I think, well, I think basically just CSA has a really important role to play within the future of food production, but also primarily just in bringing communities together in a really healthy way around the land and around food. So yeah, I don't think I would add more than that.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, it does. It works for planet and it works for people and it works for producers. It really is the model for our times. So we've got some questions. There was a question that came in for Florent around local authority support, which we are trying in the UK to get more of, but just interested in how you'd persuaded local authorities to support CSA in such a big way in France.
Yeah. Yeah, to respond to the question, we're seeing more and more local authorities just posting an announcement saying, I've got 5 acres and I want to settle an organic farm. Could you apply, or a message to CSA network, could you help me in making that possible? So we're doing 2 things. We're trying to get more and more local authorities to do that, and for that we're campaigning. For instance, we've got the regional elections in June, and for us this is a key role for CSAs if they want to mushrooms, as we said, is that we are part of the social movement, and we are citizens, and as we are citizens, we want our deciders, our politicians, to actually take decisions to actually duplicate these models. So we are campaigning and getting them to sign engagements to free land here or there, and to put in place mechanisms to train new farmers. So we push them that way, and the other thing we do is, when they take the decision to make land available for new farmers, we help them preparing that. So we've got, in the different region, we have employees in the network of CSAs, and they spend time going in discussions with the newly elected city councils to help them in concrete matters. If you want to settle a new farm, you need land, you need access to water, you need access to electricity, you need to develop the CSA, you need to communicate. So we can bring you expertise from other farmers or other CSAs to be able to make that new CSA sustainable.
Thanks.
Can I add to that briefly?
Of course.
Yeah, because basically we're also sort of trying to work with local councils, and we've had sort of just kind of by chance, really, from getting to know people within the council. For us in the UK, you know, we've got our county council for the whole Swansea region, and then we have community councils. And what we found is the county council are very supportive of the overall idea of CSA, and they do have land, but it's very cumbersome to access any of their land. They seem to have long-term, partly they don't seem to quite know which bits of land they own. And then when it comes to renting any out, they've got such complicated agreements with different people that it's difficult for them to give us access to any of those pieces of land. But in theory, they like the idea of more CSAs being set up on council land. But now what we're finding is actually we're working with a community council, and then that's much more localized for a small area of Swansea. And then those community councillors they do have much more attachment to pieces of land and can gain access quite quickly to land. So we're now actually going out tomorrow to visit a community council piece of land to measure up and sort of propose what they could be growing there. So it's something we're really keen to do. And there's a group of us, Social Farms and Gardens, and another group across Wales who are starting to discuss. We've got a funding bid in, and one of the elements of that will be to basically look at councils and how to approach council-owned land to convert to CSAs. But no, it's great to know that that's happening in France as well.
Thanks, Tom. We had a question about how could you run a CSA with land and infrastructure that wasn't suitable for growing root crops, for instance? And I just wanted to say that one of the great things about CSA is its diversity. And what we do, for instance, we do have a CSA that's just joined that's looking at doing perennial salad bags on some land that they're looking at really developing biodiversity on. So, and a lot of our CSAs buy in root crops either for a small part of the year or around the year, because either they don't have the land to grow them or because they have unsuitable land. So it's definitely not a barrier in that sense. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything on that.
I think there's some really interesting things happening with some other local authorities in other countries. For example, in the Spanish Basque country, there's a village where the local authorities have set up a collective processing facility where the processing can happen for jam, for cheese, for ham and things like that. And it is a real community facility so that the individual CSA parts can book time within that for whatever activity. And I think, again, this is very typical of solidarity economy. And we are really trying to work on the local authority dimension across Europe at this stage in a new project that we're just starting up. Again, local authorities in North America with food policy councils can be very supportive and very helpful. And basically, the more local, the more likely you are to get support. Trying to get international legislation, European legislation, and national legislation is actually a tougher nut to crack than the local. And I think, Florent mentioned, as well as Tom, how working at local level does seem to be the level where people know each other so they can actually implement things more easily.
So that kind of leads well on to a question from Christina, which was what kind of research is needed to push policy in alignment with the principles of food sovereignty?
Well, if I could say, Urgenci works as part of the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty with all the other global social movements. We are working at European level with other social movements, and particularly with the European coordination via Campesina, both on specific projects and on the Farm to Fork and European Food Policy Coalition as a pressure group at the EU level. So I think, the connections are there also with the fishers, because I think it's important to mention that the issues we're talking about are just as relevant for the small scale fishing community as they are for the small scale farming community. So we're trying to develop that as well. So the food sovereignty movement is pretty well connected at international and also increasingly at national level through the Jeleni Europe processes, for example, in Europe. And the research that we need, well, we do a lot of research in Urgenci. There are dedicated research people working with the food sovereignty movement as research activists from Coventry University and various other European universities around the world. because we do have to have evidence-based research to make a case that holds up when we are faced by the industrial food lobby and many governments today.
Thanks, Judith. And I just wanted to, there's one more question which was sort of touched on earlier, but I wondered if anyone wanted to add, which was, can you see a CSA being set up in a community-led housing project?
Yeah, well, we're sort of currently working with, I was trying to think whether it's community, not particularly community-led housing project, but we've been approached by a housing project locally, which is actually a social housing project. So it's for sort of an area of Swansea that's traditionally been council housing, and they're expanding the housing there. And it is an area of deprivation with very sort of, yeah, I'd say very little awareness of food, what kind of food is consumed. So they've approached us, so we're working with a member of that community developing that social housing project to look at how basically food production and CSA could be built into the whole housing project from the outset. But I'm not sure if you, was that the kind of community housing you were referring to?
I'm not sure we're going to find the answer to that one out.
No.
What we do know is that CSA, I mean, certainly in the UK, is incredibly diverse, and there are some CSAs that are run entirely voluntarily. There are CSAs set up in small villages to provide food simply for that village. There are CSAs who are set up more because they're set up. So those ones in villages are impulsed by villagers saying we don't have access to good agroecological food. There are CSAs set up by growers who say what I want to do with my life is grow good agroecological food, and they happen in different places, rural, increasingly in the UK, urban. As Judith said, fishing, meat, dairy, poultry, eggs, vegetables, fruit, even, we've had fuel CSAs, so all sorts of variety and all sorts of places. It's really possible anywhere. The important thing is the local solidarity, subscription, membership. And I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to that, just on the kind of strength of the diversity of the model before we finish. No? Okay, I'm going to end there. And just before I do, just to say huge thanks to our panelists, to Tom, to Florent, to Judith, to Jocelyn from Urgenci, who's been doing behind the scenes link posting, and also to ORFC for all their work organising this amazing conference, and to the interpreters who've been translating everything into French for us. So yeah, a huge thanks to everyone, and do get in touch. We'll post emails if they've not been posted already in the chat so you can see them, and yeah, do get in contact with any questions that we didn't manage to answer or questions that occur to you later. And of course you can tell your friends to rewatch this session. Thank you, and
thanks a lot.
Bye.